Squaring up for a fight as Democrats voice their fierce opposition to Donald Trump's latest appointment. The president has chosen the Conservative Appeals Court Judge Neil Gorsuch for the vacant and powerful position on the Supreme Court. The court has the final legal word on many of the most sensitive issues like abortion. We'll be live in Washington. Also this lunchtime, MPs vote today on legislation which would give the government the go-ahead to trigger Article 50, the formal process of leaving the EU. 3 generations murdered on a beach in Tunisia. An inquest hears from the teenager who survived but lost his brother, uncle and grandfather. Just the ticket. Train operators admit fares can be baffling as they promise to try out a new system to find the cheapest tickets. And the nets keeping sharks away from Australian beaches, but campaigners say they're killing dolphins and other marine life.
In the South, hidden abuse. Despite a new law, victims tell us how hard it is to get protection from a controlling partner. And frustration for the father and son who spotted this illegal act but weren't able to report it.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. Donald Trump has made one of the most significant decisions of his presidency, nominating a Conservative judge to fill a vacancy on the US Supreme Court. The nomination of Neil Gorsuch, a 49-year-old federal appeals judge, restores the court's conservative balance, but will have far-reaching consequences for America's most contested social issues, from abortion and gender to gun control. His nomination will have to be confirmed by the Senate, where Democrats have threatened to block any candidate seen as too conservative. Our correspondent Richard Lister reports.
A prime-time announcement on one of the biggest decisions of his presidency. Donald Trump's pick for the Supreme Court will influence American lives long after he leaves the White House.
Today I am keeping another promise to the American people by nominating Judge Neil Gorsuch.
The judge and his wife were brought to Washington in secret with another potential candidate who was later sent home. Mr. Trump clearly relished the game show theatrics.
So was that a surprise? Was it?
But also the reputation of his nominee.
Judge Gorsuch has outstanding legal skills, a brilliant mind, tremendous discipline, and has earned bipartisan support.
At 49, he'd be the youngest judge on the Supreme Court, and it's a job for life. But he needs some Democrat support to be confirmed, so he stuck to a carefully neutral script.
It is for Congress and not the courts to write new laws. It is the role of judges to apply, not alter, the work of the people's representatives. A judge who likes every outcome he reaches is very likely a bad judge, stretching for results he prefers rather than those the law demands.
Since the death of Judge Antonin Scalia last year, the Supreme Court's been split down the middle on ideological grounds. Judge Scalia was a devout conservative, so some see this appointment as restoring a right-leaning status quo.
We don't know how future Justice Gorsuch is going to vote on every issue. Some have said that he may actually be more conservative than Justice Scalia in some areas.
What does that mean? Well, on gun control cases, Judge Gorsuch is likely to protect the historic American right to bear arms. On abortion rights, he's expected to take the position that all human life is sacred. Same-sex marriage may also come before the court, and there his position's unclear, though President Trump approves.
My body, my choice!
There were protests outside the court last night, and the Democrats' leader in the Senate, Charles Schumer, said Neil Gorsuch has repeatedly sided with corporations over working people and demonstrated a hostility towards women's rights, which makes me sceptical that he can be a strong, independent justice.
Thank you very much.
It's not clear the Democrats can defeat this nomination, and there will be other battles. With 2 justices now over 80, President Trump may get the chance to set the court's direction for decades to come. Richard Lister, BBC News.
Well, our correspondent Kim Hattas is outside the Supreme Court, and President Trump has chosen his man. But the question is, when will he be able to take up his job?
This is not going to be a quick or smooth process, Sophie. Democrats are already calling this nomination intolerable hostile. Some even saying that Judge Gorsuch would be sitting on a stolen seat. Stolen because they say the seat should have gone to Merrick Garland, a judge nominated by President Obama last year to replace the late Antonin Scalia. But Republicans at the time shut down the nomination process. So the question is, what will Democrats do this time? Will they try to seek revenge by filibustering the nomination process? In reaction, will Republicans then try to ram it through the Senate? As I said, not quick nor easy, because so much is at stake. Confirming Judge Gorsuch to the Supreme Court will, as we've heard, change the balance on the court, tilting it back to a conservative majority on the court. And that is what this election last year was all about for social conservatives. And Donald Trump, now president, says that he knew that. At a rally last summer, he told supporters, speaking in the third person, "You may not like Donald Trump, you may think he's the worst, but you're going to vote for him. You know why? Because Supreme Justices of the court." And that's what he had on his mind when he nominated Judge Gorsuch yesterday, delivering on a campaign promise and hoping to make a lasting impact on the court. And it may not be the last time that he nominates a judge to the Supreme Court, with two other justices on the Supreme Court at least eyeing retirement.
Kim in Washington, thank you. Well, here, Theresa May has insisted that she wasn't given any warning by President Trump that he was planning a ban on refugees entering the US and travel restrictions on people from 7 mainly Muslim countries. She told Prime Minister's Questions that Mr. Trump's decision, which was announced shortly after she met him at the White House last week, was wrong and divisive. Our political correspondent Tom Bateman reports.
In a week when the opposition to President Trump's travel ban came to the Prime Minister's door, the pressure has built on ministers. The government said the policy is divisive and wrong, but that has not gone far enough for its critics.
Will you roll out the red carpet for Trump, Prime Minister?
Mrs May left for the Commons ready to face more questions about the ban. Crucially, did she find out during her trip to the White House?
Was the Prime Minister told about the ban during her visit, and did she try to persuade President Trump otherwise?
If he's asking me whether I had advance notice of the ban on refugees, the answer is no. If he's asking me if I had advance notice that the executive order could affect British citizens, the answer is no.
As Mrs May spoke of maintaining the relationship with Mr Trump, anger grew from some Labour MPs.
The President of the United States has advocated torture, misogyny, racial discrimination, sexual assault, isolationism. The leaders of Canada and Germany were able to respond robustly, but your response was to jump on a plane as soon as possible to hold his hand. Mr. Speaker, doesn't this country deserve a leader who's willing to stand up for British values?
And the Labour leader said President Trump had incited hatred against Muslims.
Just what more does the President Trump have to do before the Prime Minister will listen to the 1.8 million people who've already called for his state visit invitation to be withdrawn?
Let's just see what he would have achieved in the last week. Would he have been able to protect British citizens from the impact of the executive order? No. Would he have been able to lay the foundations of a trade deal? No. Would he have got a 100% commitment to NATO? No. He can lead a protest. I'm leading a country.
The government says it disagrees with the travel ban, even that it could be exploited by extremists. But some ministers believe some of the criticism has been alarmist and even overblown. And they have made a calculation too, that building a close relationship with Mr Trump and his team will prove more important to Britain's long-term interests. But Labour want ministers to go further, to call for the travel ban to be scrapped. So far, they seem unlikely to get their way. Tom Bateman, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, all this comes on the day that MPs will vote on the legislation giving the government the go-ahead to trigger Article 50, which formally starts the process of leaving the EU. Our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, is in Westminster, and Mrs May seems to be heading towards victory then.
Well, here we are, Sophie, on the cusp of a massive vote that will begin Brexit, and Team May are wandering around supremely relaxed, as if they're just popping down to the shops for some milk. And the reason for that is they believe the vote is in the bag. And it probably is. Why? Well, because most MPs, even if they're opposed to Brexit, accept the result of the referendum. And Mrs May had another tidbit, another concession for her critics this lunchtime, promising them her long-awaited plan for Brexit, her white paper. It's going to be published tomorrow. So most MPs are on board to back Mrs May tonight. However, it seems a very, very different story in Brussels, where our former ambassador to the EU this morning told MPs that EU leaders are poised to slap a £60 billion bill on Britain for quitting the EU because they believe Brexit, in his words, has put a bomb under their 7-year budget, and that Britain, having entered into financial agreements over 7 years, will still be expected to pay for them even after we've left the EU. More than that, he says EU leaders don't think it'll be possible to get a deal by 2020, and not much interested in transitional arrangements, and don't believe that Mrs May will walk away from the table if she can't get a deal. So Mrs may be on cruise control here, but she's facing a right old battle ahead in Brussels.
Norman Smith, thank you. The inquests into the deaths of 30 British tourists in Tunisia in June 2015 have heard from a teenager who lost his brother, uncle and grandfather in the attack. Owen Richards described in a statement how he held his grandfather in his arms as the gunfire started. Our correspondent Richard Galpin reports.
The bodies of a father, his son and grandson arriving back in Britain after the attack in Tunisia targeting British holidaymakers 2 years ago. The lives of 3 generations of the same family destroyed by a lone gunman trained by so-called Islamic State. 78-year-old Charles Evans, with his grandson Joel, who was 19, and his son Adrian, who was 49, had all gone on holiday together, but were shot dead just 12 hours after arriving at the Tunisian resort. Today, the surviving grandson, Owen, and his mother, Suzanne Richards, came to give evidence at the inquest here in London, with Mrs Richards reading moving tributes to each of those killed. Mrs Richards described how her family had been very close and loving. Her voice breaking with emotion, she said part of her had died when she learnt that her son Joel had been killed. He was a bright, shining star, she said, who had a promising future as a football referee.
One of the best things I did is my first year refereeing.
This was Joel speaking about refereeing just a month before flying out to Tunisia. His mother told the inquest he had already achieved more than many people achieve in a full lifetime. When the gunman began his rampage through the resort near Sousse 2 years ago, Joel, his brother Owen, and his grandfather and uncle tried to run and hide. Owen, who survived the attack, has provided evidence describing how his grandfather kept falling. They picked him up and eventually reached the indoor swimming pool, but the gunman was behind them and opened fire. Of the 4 of them who went on holiday together to celebrate Owen finishing his GCSE exams, it was just Owen who returned home. Richard Galpin, BBC News, at the Royal Courts of Justice.
Police in Germany have arrested a Tunisian man on suspicion of recruiting for the Islamic State group to carry out a terrorist attack. He was taken into custody in Frankfurt during a series of raids involving more than 1,000 officers in the central state of Hesse. Mosques, flats and offices were targeted. Our correspondent Damien McGuinness is in Berlin for us. So a big police operation. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, that's right, Sophie. In total, 54 raids were carried out early this morning. Now, this 36-year-old Tunisian man has been arrested because police say that he recruited for so-called Islamic State and that he had set up in Germany over the past 2 years a major Islamist network that was planning, according to police, a terror attack here in Germany. Now, they said it was only the early stages of that planning process and that there was no concrete a target as yet. But one of the most chilling pieces of information that police have issued earlier today here in Germany is that this Tunisian suspect was also wanted in Tunisia for another attack earlier in 2015 on a museum. in which 22 people were killed, many of them tourists, including British tourists. Now, this all links up to the attack which we heard about in Richard's report just now, meaning that there are also reports and investigations going on right now that possibly that attack on the museum early in 2015 was carried out by the same group that possibly carried out the attack later in 2015 on that beach resort near Sousse. So that's why right now police are investigating this Tunisian man to see if he had anything to do with either of those attacks in 2015 in Tunisia.
Damien, thank you. Train operators have announced an overhaul of the ticketing system, which they admit is baffling customers. Trials of a new system, which they say will ensure passengers pay the cheapest possible fares, will start in May on cross-country, Virgin and East Midland trains. Our correspondent Simon Gompertz is at London's King's Cross station, so even the train operators now recognise this system is baffling.
Yes, and people have been paying too much, Sophie, and they're confused at the 16 million possible permutations of tickets that, in theory, they could buy. And, of course, they're angry when they find after the event that they could have got a discount, but it's now too late. These trials will affect mainly passengers of cross-country, Virgin, East and West Coast and East Midlands passengers, and they're the beginning of the rail company's response.
It's been a long time in coming. Trials to get rid of old practices which mean you can end up paying too much for a ticket.
We already think there are loads of cheap deals out there for people, but at the moment it relies on lots of whizzy websites to find the best deal in a complicated fare system. We want to make the system simpler so that we can really ensure that people trust it and know that they're always getting the best fare every time.
One of the targets is absurd tickets like the one from Wick in Scotland. Travelling the length of the UK costs over £340 to Par in Cornwall, but just £80 if you buy different sections of the journey separately. So the trials will involve cheaper multi-leg fares, more good value singles where the single can cost as much as a return, and better information on discounted tickets from vending machines, all things MPs have been calling for.
Well, what's been happening is absolutely outrageous. People have been paying over the odds for journeys. They're not told what's the cheapest journey. And often when they purchase from machines, they're not getting equity. Different machines sell different tickets. That has to stop.
Among travellers, there's huge frustration about fares.
It's challenging, isn't it? Because there's so many different ways of purchasing tickets now.
I'd like them to be cheaper, I'd like it to be easier to navigate. Just a bit clearer, really.
So the pressure will be to make sure that passengers actually end up paying less.
This trial is only for a small number of train companies so far. We need to see this spread right across the country, and only when we see that kind of level of change, I think we'll see that kind of trust from passengers that things are improving on the railways.
Cheaper, more understandable tickets are welcome, but there are also calls for rail companies to follow a simple rule, just to sell everyone the cheapest ticket in all circumstances.
People have been posting up on the internet today after hearing about these trials photographs of the multiple tickets they've had to buy in order to do a lengthy journey. In some cases 30 or even 50 different bits of ticketing in order to do what should be covered in future by one ticket. So hopefully this problem will be dealt with, but it's part of a package of measures, Sophie, that are being brought in over the next year or so.
Simon, thank you. The time is coming up to 1:20. Our top story this lunchtime. Donald Trump's latest appointment, the Conservative judge Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court, faces fierce opposition from the Democrats. And still to come, a groundbreaking study, the doctors who've communicated with patients suffering from locked-in syndrome.
Coming up in South Today, it's a crime, but how do you report it? A father and son tell us police weren't interested when they filmed a driver using his phone illegally. And a town transformed, but will councillors give their backing to this bold new vision for Bognor Regis? Now, it's called health tourism when people travel to the UK from abroad to get free treatment on the NHS. Well, now ministers have been told to get a grip of the problem. In a damning report by MPs, the Public Accounts Committee says the system for recovering cash from patients visiting from overseas is chaotic
And they say more needs to be done to identify and charge those who leave the NHS with unpaid bills. Our health correspondent Jane Draper reports.
These tiny babies illustrate a challenge for the NHS. One of the quadruplets didn't survive the premature birth and a second died at the weekend. They've needed intensive care. Their Nigerian mother went into labour 3 months early while travelling home from America via London.
I've journeyed for 2 days in the air to get to Chicago. When I got to Chicago, they said I did not have a paper from the hospital where I'm supposed to attend in US. Therefore, they will not allow me in.
The hospital looking after Priscilla and her babies has to recoup the cost of care for overseas patients. In a BBC documentary tonight, she's given news about her mounting bill from the NHS. It quickly reaches 6 figures.
The thing is, Priscilla, the hospital bills are going to be quite high.
I didn't plan to come here.
No, I understand
The situation changed.
To understand that it's a very difficult time for you, but we do need to talk about the charges for hospital treatment. The next stage really is to let her know that we have to start raising invoices on a regular basis, so it'll be a weekly basis. And those invoices are going to be huge. 20 grand a week for each baby.
MPs say the Department of Health must get better at recovering costs from foreign visitors who end up as patients, because a hard-pressed NHS is missing out on vital funds. The government has set a target to collect £500 million a year from overseas patients by 2018, but is currently only managing to recover just under £290 million. One of the biggest areas of concern is getting money back from European countries where agreements are in place. The latest figures show the UK recovered £50 million from these countries, but paid out £675 million.
Overall NHS budget is much less than even 0.1%. But every pound counts, and every pound that's brought in is obviously can be spent on patient care. But the key thing is here is the government hasn't set up a system for hospitals and other health providers to collect the payments that overseas patients owe.
Priscilla sees her 2 surviving babies every day and is being helped by a charity. Her medical bills are currently unpaid. Doctors' leaders say systems for charging patients from overseas are important, but they shouldn't jeopardise people who need care from getting it. Jane Draper, BBC News.
Scientists say patients with absolutely no control over their bodies have been able to communicate. A computer has helped to analyse the brain signals of 4 patients in Switzerland who all have complete locked-in syndrome, and they were able to answer basic yes or no questions. Well, our medical correspondent Fergus Walsh is here. There are only 4 people, but it is incredible they've been able to communicate with them.
It's absolutely fascinating. So these 4 patients have a progressive neurological disorder that makes them completely paralysed. They're aware, they can think, but they cannot move. They can't even blink an eye. So what the scientists did was they got them to wear a cap which uses infrared sensors to measure very subtle variations in blood flow on when you give a yes or a no answer. And I think we can see one of the participants here. This is 26-year-old Kirsten. Now she's being asked a series of simple yes or no questions. First of all, is Berlin the capital of France? No. Is your mother's name Margit? In her case, yes. And once they have those answers, they then move on to more complex questions with a yes or no answer. Now, this method was devised by a British neuroscientist, Adrian Owen, who some years ago showed that if you put some patients in an MRI scanner, you measure their blood flow, you could give yes or no responses. The great thing about this is it can be done at the bedside of the patient.
And the answers that they got were surprising in many ways.
They were. All 4 patients said they were happy with their lives. Now, that's quite a challenge to the preconceptions that many people would have about being completely paralysed, being tube-fed and on a ventilator. And then some of the answers that came out were perhaps not welcome. There was a daughter who asked her 61-year-old father, completely paralysed, is it okay, should I marry my boyfriend Mario? 9 times out of 10, he said no. Well, I have to tell you, Sophie, they got married anyway.
Fergus, thank you. Police in Los Angeles have carried out their biggest ever operation to find girls and young women who've been forced into commercial sexual exploitation. Officers made almost 500 arrests and rescued more than 50 young people. Our correspondent Angus Crawford was given exclusive access to the operation and sent this report.
Look beyond the handcuffs and the painted nails. These aren't adults, just girls aged 16 and 17, arrested on the street for prostitution. Once inside, no cell, no bars or locks, just a room. A place of safety where young people can get help and support.
We find minors every day that we're out here working. 11's the youngest that we've had, though.
On the street they call the Blade, in the richest country in the world, children are bought and sold at any time of day, every day.
The car approached her. She's again moving, slowly moving.
Sergeant Brian Gallagher heads the area vice unit. His job tonight, find those girls, get them off the street. They stop a man they recognise. He has a passenger. It's cold and she's shivering.
It's 4 o'clock in the morning and a routine patrol of the vice squad here has pulled over a car driven by a man they know is a pimp. When they stopped it, a young woman got out of the car and they're concerned about her.
She says she's 19. Her parents have reported her missing. See her tattoo? It's the name of her pimp. Here, they call it branding.
So a lot of these girls, when we talk to them, they'll tell us they're out here for 20 hours a day working. They get a little bit of food. They get abused physically, sexually. It's just barbaric what's being done to these little kids.
My cousin grabbed me on the way home from school.
America is slowly waking up to reality. Thousands of children are being sexually exploited for money.
I'm 12 years old. 12 years old.
That's why they launched Operation Reclaim and Rebuild, statewide, lasting 3 days. Prostitutes and customers arrested, processed. Some are released with a warning, for others it's jail. Just 18, caught for a second time, Treasure. She started on the street in middle school.
You were a child when you first started doing this?
Yeah.
What sort of things have happened to you working on the street?
Raped. Somebody put a knife out on me, a gun, tried to rob me.
This is Crystal?
Crystal is in for an unpleasant surprise. The caller is an undercover officer arranging a sting in a hotel room.
Police department, can you turn around? Police department, turn around.
This time, the prostitute is an adult. So why's she here? Just listen.
My life is falling apart. This is the only thing I can do to survive on these streets right now.
For Detective Brian Gallagher, it seems never ending. Children forced to work the streets turn into women who know only this, a life of violence and exploitation. Angus Crawford, BBC News, Los Angeles.
Campaigners in Australia are calling for an end to the use of shark nets at beaches because they're killing dolphins and turtles. Conservationists argue that the nets are damaging the ecosystem. Our correspondent, Hal Griffith, sent this report.
In a country where catching a wave is a national obsession, the allure of the ocean is endless, as is the debate over how best to share these waters with some of the locals. Shark nets have been Australia's answer since the 1930s. Sections are set hundreds of metres out at sea. They don't create an enclosure, but they do offer reassurance.
I think they're a great idea. We've got to try to protect our kids, so that's what it's all about to me.
Probably against them. So you see creatures in the wildlife getting stuck out there.
You take a risk if you swim in the ocean, and that's where sharks belong.
That's what the nets are meant to keep out. Great whites are one of 10 species targeted by the programme here in New South Wales.
The nets are put in place from September to April when these beaches are at their busiest. Last year they trapped over 130 of the targeted, more dangerous sharks, but they also trapped another 600 marine animals, including dolphins, rays and turtles.
This video shows what happens when one becomes entangled. A group of tourists managed to set this turtle free, but 19 others died in the nets last year. The nets have whale and dolphin alarms. They're checked every 3 days. Around half of the animals are set free alive, but some campaigners have decided to take matters into their own hands.
This is their home, that's where they live. We can't sort of exclude them from where they live. They're not coming up into the car parks to get us, so let's not go in the ocean to kill them.
There hasn't been a fatal shark attack on these beaches in 60 years. The local government says it's a sign the nets do work and that cutting them is dangerous.
Obviously, it's very dangerous, not only for the individuals involved, but creating a real hazard for the swimmers and surfers at those beaches.
Finding the right balance between protecting humans and preserving sea life is a challenge. Here it seems as elusive as ever. Howell Griffith, BBC News, Sydney.
Time for a look at the weather now with Chris Fawkes. Not much Australian sunshine here at the moment.
No, just little glimmers today, Sophie. But you're right, the Atlantic is alive with storm system after storm system. The reason? We've got a very fast jet stream moving across the Atlantic, blasting across at around 200 miles an hour, and it's that's creating a succession of low pressure systems heading towards the British Isles. Now, we've got a lump of cloud today across eastern areas, bringing a bit of rain. For tomorrow, another area of low pressure will be bringing some strong winds our way. But on Friday, a storm system will be moving in from the western Atlantic, and that has the potential to bring us some severe weather. I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. There are some snatches of sunshine around then today. That was the scene in Moray in North Scotland and across central portions of the UK. Skies will try to brighten up just for a time today. Still a bit of rain, though, across eastern counties of England, slowly clearing, and a few showers coming in across the southwest of England and Wales. The mild air continues to push a little bit further northwards, so highs of 9 degrees for West Scotland and Northern Ireland, but still quite chilly across North Scotland and eastern Scotland, eastern England too. Now, overnight tonight, we're going to see a few more patches of rain working northwards and eastwards, and then later in the night, a more active system is going to be bringing a bout of rain in across Northern Ireland, much of England and Wales turning wet as well. It will be a mild night for most, but we could just about see a touch of frost across sheltered glens in northern Scotland. Now for tomorrow's forecast, it is going to be a windy day. We're looking at gales around our western and southern coasts and hills. Band of rain pushes its way northwards and eastwards, followed by a little bit of sunshine, but then more rain to end the day works into Wales and southwest England. Temperature-wise, well, it will be a milder day, particularly for northeast Scotland, highs of 9 degrees here, around 11 or 12 degrees for England and Wales, so similar to the temperatures we'll have today. But then, you might remember yesterday we were talking about a potential big storm on Friday. Still a bit of uncertainty about the track it's going to take. The most likely track probably bringing the worst of the severe gales and disruption into parts of northwestern France. But a small change in the jet stream could send the really fierce winds careering into southern England. Why is it important then? Well, this storm system is going to be very, very active. It looks pretty nasty, a reasonable chance of some disruptive weather. As I say, at the moment, probably the worst of the conditions heading in across France. And actually, across the northern half of the UK on Friday, not a bad day. Bright and breezy, sunny spells, a few showers in the west. But how much rain we get and how strong the winds get depend on the track of that low. But there is the potential for getting some severe gales coming through during Friday afternoon and into the evening time, affecting southern England. So that could well affect the rush hour home during Friday evening. We'll be firming up on the details of that forecast over the next day or so. Sophie.
Chris, thank you very much. And that is all from the BBC News at 1 on BBC One. It's time for the BBC's news teams where you are. Bye-bye.